Some analysts believe that the reason Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022 was to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. In 2014, with the fall from power of the pro-Russian Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, Ukraine demonstrated a strong interest in getting closer to the Occident and joining NATO, in a plan that aimed at its economic growth and national security against potential enemies such as Russia, which shortly after Yanukovych's fall invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, and began financing separatist movements in Donetsk and Lugansk. Ukraine's entry into NATO was seen by Kremlin as a threat to Russian national security, as it would bring enemy nations within a few kilometers of Russian territory. In 2022, in order to press Ukraine to give up on NATO membership, Russia slowly moved its troops closer to Ukrainian territory and escalated tension, with promises of war if NATO's rapprochement continued. Even with the Russian president denying any intention of invading Ukraine, this movement of Russian troops close to Ukraine made many analysts believe in a Russian invasion if Ukraine did not comply with Russian demands. Russia poses a threat to Ukraine, and Ukraine's entry into NATO poses a threat to Russia. This was the main factor that in 2022 further separated Russia and Ukraine. Russia wants the end of NATO close to its territory and the demilitarization of Ukraine. Ukraine wants its sovereignty and its territory occupied by Russia. Many negotiations to avoid the war between Russia and Ukraine were held, but none of the parties accepted the terms to achieve the peace and end the tensions. The failure of peace negotiation and the constant movement of Russian troops close to Ukraine lead us to February 24, 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now in 2023, a year of war is complete. Many lives have been lost, many cities have been destroyed, and Ukraine is completely devastated. After everything that happened, we began to ask ourselves, how could Ukraine and its allies have avoided the war? How could the allies have helped Ukraine better than they did? And the main question, how could Ukraine survive without NATO? Well, there are several options Ukraine could have chosen to avoid the war without having to join NATO, but we will talk about the one that seems to be the easiest. One important point to pay attention on, there is a possibility that if Ukraine joined NATO in 2014 or in 2022, things would not improve, further escalating tensions in that region that would result in a conflict bigger than the war between Russia and Ukraine. So how could Ukraine survive without NATO? Let's pay attention to the current scenario in Ukraine. Ukraine does not have any military alliance, but since the beginning of the Russian invasion, Ukraine has been receiving a brutal amount of money and military equipment from several countries, many members of NATO. Seeking for peace without having to join NATO and avoiding the war, Ukraine and its allies could have accepted the Russian condition of not joining NATO. In this way, the allies would continue to arm Ukraine until it was capable of defending itself against possible threats, send enough weapons, money, ammunition, and equipment to make Russia pose no threat to Ukraine. It may seem an absurd nonsense, but if you pay attention, it is the same thing that is happening with the sending of weapons to Ukraine. The difference is that now is happening in a state of war. Not necessarily transforming Ukraine into a military power equal to or greater than Russia, which would take time and more expense, but enabling Ukraine to defend the land, sky, and sea of its territory, which means that Ukraine could accept the Russian condition of not joining NATO, but not accept its demilitarization, because all countries have the right to find ways to defend their people and their territory, even if it means joining NATO. In the same way that Russia does not accept Ukraine's entry into NATO for the sake of Russian national security, Ukraine would deny its demilitarization for the sake of Ukraine's national security. This seems like a very viable solution, but on the contrary, the Allies insisted on having Ukraine into NATO, even though they knew that the situation in Donbass made this impossible. The alliance did not accept countries that are in a military conflict as members. This seems like a fairly easy way to avoid the war, but in times of pressure and panic, easy solutions are hard to find. In my point of view, Ukraine had the chance to avoid the invasion, but the presence of possible allies made Ukraine feel comfortable and forget the reality. The reality that in 2022, Ukraine had no military alliance and no chances against Russia. Ukraine needed time to prepare its troops for war, and especially to face an enemy like Russia. But if it was so easy to avoid the war in Ukraine, then why wasn't it possible? The main factor that resulted in the loss of Russian and Ukrainian lives and the destruction of several cities in Ukraine was the ego. Russia was afraid to give up pressure on Ukraine because of NATO and the sanctions. It would represent fear and weakness, but result in peace. NATO was afraid of giving up Ukraine because of Russia, an alliance pressured by a single country. This would represent fear and weakness, but result in peace. Ukraine was afraid of giving up on NATO and submitting to Russian conditions and losing sovereignty over its own territory. This would represent fear and weakness, but result in peace. Sometimes we only know what is right after making the mistake. Giving up NATO in exchange for peace does not seem like a big sacrifice. But this is not the way Ukraine sees the situation. For Ukraine, it would just be a false sense of peace. Maybe that's why they risked joining NATO, to have a real guarantee of national security. If Ukraine could survive without NATO and without needing a conflict with Russia, then why the war? The answer is quite simple: rivalry. Because of the rivalry, it appeared that none of the parties involved were looking for peace, but rather a way to harm the rival nation. NATO provoked Russia. Russia threatened Ukraine, and Ukraine sought total freedom from Russia, but received wrong advice. That's why so many negotiations ended in failure. Seems like no one was looking for peace. But we can surely say that NATO and Russia pulled in Ukraine to the war.